Well, this has been quite a journey, this Green Mile. We spent time with Christ in Gethsemane, and we've seen the evidences, solemn proof of his sonship, that he is, in fact, the Son of God. And then last week we looked at the man specifically that Jesus of Nazareth replaced as we took a look into the face of Barabbas. Today we are going to visit a climax to the Green Mile. Jesus having been betrayed in the garden and then wrongly convicted and condemned in Pilate's judgment hall. And the Green Mile reached its ephesus in Jesus' life at Golgotha, where he spoke some of the most important words of his life. You often read in history, all great men, about their last words. And we're going to talk about the 7 last words of Jesus. 7 utterances, 7 words in different areas, beginning when he had first been crucified and raised between heaven and earth. And so we first hear words that seemed so strange to us when he said from the cross, in the book of Luke, chapter 23, it's recorded, verse 34, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." And this is called the word of forgiveness. It's an amazing thing. I think about Old Testament when the entire nation of Israel stood to be judged by God because of their idolatry and turning from God and building a false molten calf and worship that calf. And God said, "I'm going to wipe this nation of Israel off the face of the earth." And Moses stood between God and the nation of Israel. He said, "Don't do this, God. Do not do this. If you will, have mercy on your people. But if you won't have mercy, wipe me off with them." The forgiveness. Not that they deserved it, not that they had earned it. That's what makes grace grace. When Jesus came to earth and the angels made the announcement that the Son of God had been born and was living among men, they sang a song that was quite remarkable. They said, "Peace on earth and goodwill toward men." And at a time when God could have declared war against this planet, he sent the message, peace on earth and goodwill toward men. And when men, in their sinfulness, had beaten the Son of God beyond recognition, when they had torn his brow with a crown of thorns, when they had tortured him beyond description and forced him to carry his own cross until his physical limitations would not allow him to go further, and at length had driven nails through his hands and his feet, and he had been lifted up from the earth, he used his struggling breath to speak the words that are beyond human comprehension when he said, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing." Surely the planet was at risk that moment. For if God had determined to destroy this planet and vanquish every life that drew a breath, He would have been more than justified in doing so had it not been for the words of Jesus. Forgive them, Father. They don't know what they're doing. The second word that Jesus spoke was called the word of salvation. Being mocked and ridiculed by virtually everyone, from the high priest to the guards who cast lots for his clothes, to the scribes who mocked the name that was written above the cross that said, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." And even to his left was a robber who was being crucified for sins and crimes that he had done. And this robber had the audacity to look at the precious Son of God and say, "If you're really the Son of God, bring yourself down. And us too." But the other thief being crucified just on the other side of Jesus repented, relented, and said to the thief that no doubt had been his partner in crime, "Don't you even fear God? We deserve what we're receiving here today, but this man's done nothing wrong." And he had absolutely nothing to offer Jesus. Not a minute of service, not a minute of good works, not a minute of restitution for a life that he had spent in sin. He just said, "Master, would you remember me?" Suddenly realizing that the certainty of death was soon to cast him into a sinner's, devil's hell, when he would be once and forever forgotten, not remembered by his family, not remembered even by those that had committed crimes with him. And the only thing that seemed important to him at that moment, when he had no place to ask for reprieve, "Lord, would you remember me when you come into your kingdom?" And Jesus spoke the word of salvation when he said, "Verily I say unto you, this day you will be with me in paradise." That is the hope of every one of us here. There's not one of us that could look past the grave with any certainty of the future had it not been for the word of salvation. Today, you will be with me in paradise. The third word that Jesus spoke is called the word of relationship. Actually, two sentences. There is among the many masters that depicted the crucifixion with the work of art, with a painting, is the painting that depicts the crucifixion viewed from the cross. And from that perspective, you see the howling mob, those that cried, "Crucify him." You see the Roman soldiers, and you see the scribes who mockingly shook their heads and ridiculed the Son of God. But among that crowd is a small huddle of a few women and one man. These were a few of the women that had supported this ministry. Mary Magdalene, out of whom the Lord had cast 7 demon spirits, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, that was seeing the fulfillment of the prophecy of Simeon that said, "A sword will pierce your soul too." And when all was lost and this man in his humanity suffered as words fail me to describe, Jesus saw his mother. And he said, "Woman, behold your son." He was speaking of the man that stood next to her. The man that is described in the Gospel of John is that disciple whom Jesus loved. It was, in fact, John the Beloved, the only one of the disciples that we know that accompanied Jesus to the site of the crucifixion. And he said to her, referring to John, "Behold your son," and then spoke to John and said, "Behold your mother." And at that moment, John took responsibility for Mary, took her into his family, and we know historically that he cared for her the rest of her life. In fact, the reason that Mary, who had spent her whole life in Galilee and in an infrequent visit to Jerusalem, died in the city of Ephesus. And that was because John was the pastor at Ephesus, and he took her along with his family to that city, and that's where she lived out her days. You see, Jesus shows even in that moment his sense of humanity and the responsibility that he had, the oldest son, to see to the welfare of his widowed and grieving mother, and entrusted her to the care of the disciple whom Jesus loved. Then the fourth word was called the word of destiny. And I suppose more than any of the words that Jesus spoke from the cross, this is the one that to me has been shrouded with the most mystery. And I have tried in my mind, and I'm going to let you just for a few moments make this journey with me as we consider what Jesus said and why he was to say these words. Apparently, by this time, he has come to a physical condition of being in shock from the pain and specifically from the great amount of blood that he had lost. Beginning when he shed blood like drops of sweat in Gethsemane, and then the beating at Pilate's judgment hall, the crown of thorns, the nails through his hands and his feet. And he speaks strangely enough, because common language of the time and his language for most days was Greek. But now he speaks in Arabic. And he says, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I had to question, well, why now did he speak in the language of Nazareth, the town where he grew up in? Why did he speak in a different language than the one that he used day to day? And it certainly what must have been because his cognizant ability was beginning to wane with his life. But why would he say those words? My God, why have you forsaken me? Because we remember that what he said to Peter was, don't you know that right now I could call to the Father and he would send 12 legions of angels to deliver me? No one takes my life from me. I will lay my life down and I will take it up again. why did he say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And I thought, as many people have speculated, that the Father, not able to look at sin, turned his head. But I want to tell you that God looks at sin every single day. The sinner might hope that he turns his head, but he doesn't turn his head. The sinner might hope he can find a place to hide, but there's nowhere that God is not there. And because he doesn't act immediately, some rebel has said, well, God doesn't know. God doesn't care. God's not going to act, and they don't even realize that God has made it known. And just because he doesn't bring judgment immediately doesn't mean he will not bring judgment ultimately. And in the 50th Psalm, God said, I'm taking all your sins and I'm lining them up like an army against you, and they will march to you in judgment. God looks at sin every day. He sees it. He notes it. Nothing gets by his eye. Jesus became not sin. He became the sin sacrifice. And so perhaps the Father did find it impossible to see his Son suffer to that degree and do nothing. But Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And as he did, he was beginning the words of the 22nd Psalm that begins with those words and would have been learned in that language. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Why have you forgotten me? Why did you forsake me? And the psalm continues to explain why the Father allowed the Son to suffer the death of the cross, that he died that we could live. And so all those people that had ridiculed him and said, if you're really the Son of God, why doesn't God come and take you from the cross? He explained it to them that day with that psalm. He's left me here. I am dying so that you can live. The fifth word was called the word of distress. That's when Jesus said, I thirst. One of the Romans, when got a sponge, put it on a reed and put it sour wine and put it up to Jesus' mouth. And he tasted. What I want you to see is, in case someone questions the sacrifice, Jesus, first of all, was offered a narcotic before he was nailed to the cross, and he refused it. In other words, to lighten the suffering, even the Romans found some bit of tenderness when they thought we should offer a narcotic to lessen the suffering. Jesus refused it. And now, just moments before his death, he says, I thirst. And it shows us. To the very end, he remained in his humanity. He suffered no different than you would suffer if it was you that was nailed to a cross. He felt the same pain, the same anguish, the same distress. I thirst. The real irony, I suppose, is his thirst announced his humanity. But in fact, though he was thirsty, he's the one who made the seas. He took that role and suffered to that degree as no man has ever suffered. He became the sin sacrifice. He became the sin who knew no sin. that we might be the righteousness of God through him. The sixth word was considered the word of triumph. John 19 records in verse 30, Jesus said with a loud voice, "It is finished." Those almost sounds like the words of defeat, but exactly the opposite. I think of what was stated at a funeral service we were at just a week ago when someone was quoted to look in the obituary and see the name of someone they knew. And he turned to his wife and said, "He's done it. He's finished the course. He's kept the faith. He's done it." And Jesus at that moment, and all that he had endured, and all that he had suffered, he had known for days that this day was coming. And now he said, "It's over. It is finished." He didn't just mean that the pain was over. He meant that his journey was over. He had walked the green mile. He had met his destiny. He had done what was appointed for him to do in order to obtain atonement for the human race. It is finished. His life was over. His dying was over. The suffering was over. Now, there was nothing for him to look ahead to except the resurrection. It was over. The suffering was done. There's another significance to this statement. It was like a rubber stamp that you would put on a bill that says paid in full. Said, "It is finished. The debt's been paid." I want to tell you something. I guarantee you that there are many, many people, according to the teachings of the Scripture, more that are going to be lost than those that are going to be saved. But that is not necessary. I said that is not necessary. Anyone who's lost is lost needlessly. If those people go to hell, go there, they went there for no purpose, because Jesus has paid the price that everyone can be redeemed, everyone can be saved. There is no one that needs to be lost. Jesus has paid it all. The entire bill is finished. Jesus has paid it all. And his final word is the word of reunion. After he said, "It is finished," and with his last breath coming out of his body, he said, "Father, under your hands I commit my spirit." He said before his crucifixion, he said, "I have come from the Father, and I am going back to the Father." And at that moment, his last words on this earth was, "Father, I am coming back. Under your hands I commit my spirit." What happened after that has spurned theological debates down through the centuries of time. And exactly the order that events transpired, I am not completely sure. But I know that when the body of Jesus of Nazareth released the spirit that was in it, that spirit was headed to the presence and to the hand of God the Father. I want to tell you there's something else special about that. The Bible tells us that the man Abraham had waited his entire life to have a son that would be his heir. And he was 99 years old when his wife became pregnant at the age of 90. That's a long time to wait for a son. And when Abraham was 100 years old, that little boy was born. Named him Isaac because that means laughter. And you'd have laughed too. If you're, I don't know if you'd laughed when you're 100 years old and got up for midnight feeding or not. But that boy was weaned and came up through his infancy into adolescence. And then one day God spoke to Abraham and said, Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest. And I want you to take him to Mount Moriah and offer him up as a burnt sacrifice to me. Really? This 13-year-old child, and you're over 110 years old, and you've waited your whole life for this boy. And now God says, I want you to offer him up as a burnt sacrifice to me. Well, I know that you know the story, that Abraham did what God asked, and he took the boy, and he took wood for a burnt offering, took fire in his hand, took a knife to take the boy's life, and went to Mount Moriah. Now, God stopped him and said, now I know that you will not withhold Isaac, your only son, from me, the one that you love. I know you won't. You don't hurt the boy. The book of Hebrews said that Abraham believed. This is what Hebrews said. Abraham believed that God was able to raise him up. He was simply doing what God asked him to do. You see, Abraham got exactly what God got that day. When God stopped him and said, no, don't hurt that boy. And Abraham cut the ropes that had bound his son. He received him just like he had raised him from the dead. He believed that he was able, and in fact, they held him. That's exactly what the Father experienced. See, Isaac was a foreshadow of Jesus. And the day that Jesus spoke his last, God did raise him up, and he held him in his arms. The special thing about what Jesus did was when he committed his life to the hands of the Father, he was making it possible for all of us to do the same thing. I really don't know what demons scream into the ears of people when they sit in a service like this. But I believe that they try to convince them. Now, this part of the service does not include you. This part of the service, you're disqualified. You cannot be put in the hands of God. I'm here to tell you today that when Jesus said, unto your hands I commit my spirit, he was making it possible that every man, everywhere, through all time, if you have a will to give your life to God, you can give your life to God. If you want the hand of God in your life, you can have it. I don't care what the past has been, and I don't care what the threat of the future holds for you. I'm here to tell you today that because Jesus did what he did, you can put your life in his hands today. You can do it.